When you don't see or hear or read articles, news pieces about women in the rural Afghanistan, it is not a direct indication that nothing is happening.
Welcome to our podcast, Understanding Agency Through the Lens and Experiences of Afghan Women. I'm Mary Morphew, and this podcast is made together with my team members Ishita Bathia, Poorvi Parakhhas, and Pedro Sanchez. We are students of the Graduate Institute of Geneva and have made this podcast as part of our course on Human Rights and Humanitarianism through the Concepts. The initial idea for making this podcast stemmed from our interest in women's rights and their agency in areas that have long histories of conflict and instability. Considering the recent shift in regime, we wanted to focus on Afghanistan. However, in this process, we were led to understand the very Western and colonial connotations of the terms emancipation and women's rights, especially with reference to Afghanistan. We also came to realize how the status of Afghan women had to be studied ethnographically in context to their history and culture, and not simply through the mainstream, media-led popular narrative on the idea of liberating the Afghan women from the oppression of Afghan men. It's a very Eurocentric and a Western idea to view liberation and freedom only through the lens of democratization. In our podcast, we would like for our listeners to take away an image of women's rights in Afghanistan that is not contextualized solely in a westernized context. In an attempt to do this, we would like to deconstruct the concepts of emancipation, agency, and freedom while also understanding the current context of their rights. In this way, our lens of analysis passes through the concept of shelters, also known as Khanai Aman, and their role in supporting or not Afghan women, specifically runaway women, in inhabiting their own worlds with their own definitions. On top of this, as another lens of analysis and to delve deeper into the experiences of these women, we wanted to reach out to women that have lived and studied this context and that align in their academic and professional fields with our approach to the podcast. First of all, we read in detail personal stories and accounts from the book Pious Peripheries, Runaway Women in Post-Taliban Afghanistan by Dr. Sonia Ehsan Tirmizi, and we are extremely honored as she kindly agreed to have a discussion and answer some of our questions for this podcast. Further, we wanted to deepen our search for answers and were delighted to also speak with Dr. Orzala Nemet, an Afghan women's rights activist and scholar that ran a shelter for runaway women in Kabul and shared her insights about today's situation. We strongly believe that their personal experiences and interactions with the Afghan women is an important component in giving a deeper insight into the condition of the Afghan women today and what the future might hold for them without letting it be solely influenced by the Western discourse. That being said, I would now like to introduce another member of my team, Pedro, who has also been taking part in the interview process with Sonia and Orzala.
Thank you, Mary. Let us start by introducing Dr. Ehsan Tirmizi. She's a lecturer at Columbia University in New York, where she teaches in the departments of Anthropology and Middle East and South Asian and African Studies. Her book, Pious Peripheries, Runaway Women in Afghanistan, was published by Stanford University Press in 2021. In our interview with her, we began talking about the underrepresentation of theoretical and historical scholarship in regards to gender in Afghanistan. We asked her why she thought this underrepresentation existed. From her perspective, we understood that there is a rise of what she termed as crypto-colonialism, where many discourses are presented but with an absence of analysis. This means that there is a lack of historical and theoretical perspectives, thinking from the point of view of what Afghan women think of themselves. Most of the scholarship on the condition of women in Afghanistan today is ahistorical, as if these emerged without any context to their history, which is exactly our point for discussing this topic today, to try and understand it from a perspective that is not funded on this scholarship. Sonia also discussed the paradox one may encounter while studying Afghan women. On one end, there is too much, and on the other, it is not enough, or rather not done in the way that actually emerges from their perspective. The scholarship should introduce an element of cultural contextualization to give them the space, if there is such a space, to reclaim or define it in their own terms. Through Dr. Ehsan Tirmizi's perspective, Connected to the scholarship, we engage in discussing a definition for a classical Western approach. And once again, the message she relied on is aligned with the lack of historical contextualization. Here is the main idea she shared with us.
We think of these people without history as if the present condition it just emerged out of no historical circumstances, as if there is no history. And there's so many people who've written on that, and especially in this literature that I am extremely familiar with and that I studied in my PhD and then I'm teaching it for many years, is the subaltern studies.
So, because of this lack of historical and cultural understanding, there is a tendency to victimize women and attach them to the label of needing to be saved, rescued, or protected. A Western approach to humanitarian intervention and towards women's rights that fails to account for the history, culture, or context of women is limited, and therefore invalid in unpacking what agency might mean for them, or what their actual agenda in terms of wants and needs might look like. The classical Western notion follows its own historical trajectory that cannot map the history of what Afghan women went through. Here is where Dr. Ehsan Termizi did remark an important idea that is central to the understanding of this approach.
Freedom as an end goal for all peoples, and what that freedom looks like is also not the same for everyone.
Outside of this notion of having to be saved, rescued, or protected, certain groups of women in Afghanistan become runaway, going to a Hana Yamen or shelter. Dr. Ehsan Termizi here had something to say about the concept of runaway.
Let's just define what the shelter was. This was a space that was initially funded by non-Afghan sources, non-South Asian sources, but then slowly it was taken over by local sources. And this was a place where women who were running away from and the history of runaway is actually quite long, and we know that women were running away for a long time, but this was a place that was quite modern in the sense that it came post 9/11, and it housed these runaway women. So the concept of runaway is not new, but the shelter and the housing of the runaway in the shelter is something modern, and that's new. And these so the category of the runaway was actually even defined by the colonials, by the British, and there was a category of the runaway. So if you look at the British archives, this is a very old concept of women who reject certain conditions and then decide to leave their familial context and then go out.
Like we mentioned at the beginning, the role of the shelters is important in giving some thought to how women function in these spaces. To become runaway takes courage, taking a leap of faith as they leave their house for their own reasons, which are very different and specific on a case-by-case level. Although imperfect, shelters present themselves as an alternative option for Afghan women in their search for justice and telling their stories, in having, in a way, a voice and in inhabiting their own worlds.
But what was common between these women was that they had been ostracized by their community, or that they had rejected the community themselves, and they had no other place to go, and they ended up at the Khana Aman.
What simultaneously emerges from this analysis and at the center of our inquiry is defining the concept of emancipation or space in regards to these shelters. Why isn't there an easy answer to this debate?
It was already marginal, and being at the Khana Aman further ostracized and further marginalized these women, and some of those women owned that marginalization.
Coming to the shelter is an individual path, a hard one, and thus an individual answer for these women. While discussing and researching runaway women, we realized that the path of runaway was different for everyone. But what brought them together was that they were either ostracized by or they had abandoned the society itself. While the shelter was not a cure-all, as mentioned by Sonia, for it did not end up giving a lot of space to these women, it was more to do with what the women wanted by coming there. Therefore, if one is to define emancipation as walking away from oppression, then perhaps there is an emancipatory space. But it's important to note that the use of this word can be problematic. Focusing on their agency and understanding their runaway journey might be a better approach. That being said, we asked ourselves the question of whether there is a certain level of agency that we could define by this action of running away. Dr. Ehsan Termizi found this question more appropriate and contributed.
So when I think of agency, I thought of agency for these Afghan women as neither a rejection of their circumstances, of their oppressive circumstances, nor an acceptance of it. So I call it a nomadic form of agency. And that is why I think that from agency, we can't come to a clear cut concept of emancipation, that we have to think of it much more carefully.
A common theme represented in Western media, according to Dr. Essen Termizi, is the understanding of agency as a rejection or a challenge to oppressive circumstances. But the Afghan women have diversified this notion by moving beyond the binaries of oppressive and submissive. In inhabiting the status of the runaway, either they gain more power when they come back, or their position is further oppressed because more constraints are placed on them, and in some cases, they may choose to never go back. In such cases, some women choose to stay in liminal status for a longer period. The act of living, as addressed by Dr. Essen Termizi, through her personal experience and accounts of her friends, takes a lot of courage. She stated that it takes a lot of courage to walk away and to end up in a place that is completely unpredictable. In this decision, in casting themselves from society, it seems that there's an empowering element that embodies the notion of respect and honor.
Does take at the end of the day and this is not to romanticize resistance or romanticize freedom, but it takes a lot of courage to walk away. When you think of respect and honor, so many times you think of that as living the normative rules and following rules, but in this case some of the women thought that breaking the rules could also be would give them respect.
Up to this point, we hope the ideas presented from our discussion with Sonia have helped clarify how to unpack the concepts we set out to explain at the beginning of our podcast: Western narratives, emancipation, agency, and freedom. Our second interviewee that contributed to our thematic discussion is Dr. Orzala Nemat. Dr. Nemat is an internationally known Afghan scholar and think tank leader. She has focused her career on helping women and girls in her community as a practitioner, and often appears in international media and different platforms discussing Afghanistan and its current developments. With Dr. Nemat, we wanted to further our analysis in three areas: Western narrative deconstruction, shelters, and taking a look at the current state of affairs for women's rights in Afghanistan, with a view to ultimately try and understand what could happen in the next few months. According to her, it is important to see emancipation for women from a historical context. This was first highlighted by Sonia's remarks, and here is where in our second interview, Dr. Nemat added some remarks that cemented our approach to the issue of moving outside of narratives that do not have Afghan society and history at their core. Understanding the historical context of any region is extremely vital for us to be aware of the various experiences and dynamics of the women who live there. Evidence from different fields of history will also allow us to understand the present context better. This is a concept that has been lacking in mainstream media.
So consequently, when we say about the Western, the troubling aspect of the Western narrative about Afghanistan, we have to be careful that the Western narrative is also not the Western as one narrative. In my own research, what I found was conflicting narratives. So we have this let's liberate the Afghan woman statement, and then we have very sort of contradictory narratives. Like Sonia in her book is doing an amazing job of trying to highlight that these women, it doesn't mean that emancipation for them as dressing like Westerns, the way that some people are trying to portray that. So back far from that point all the way through this, a broader contextual and historical a review of the literature, review of the evidences from different phases of history will allow us to better understand the present context. It's maybe the case everywhere. If we look at the Great Britain, if we look at the France, the history of France and everything, it's not different from that. But what makes Afghanistan very critical in this kind of, and it sort of highlights the importance of historical context, is because we have been at the crossroads of civilizations, West and East. And that means we have been an epicenter of interventions throughout the history. the fact that the struggle for women's rights, for human rights in Afghanistan or anywhere else, particularly in Afghanistan, did not immediately begin with the presence of international military forces or international organizations, and it will also not end with them.
Another reason why Afghanistan becomes an interesting case is because it has been at a crossroads of civilization between the East and the West as an epicenter of interventions. There isn't just one single narrative, but a multitude of conflicting and contradictory ones. Even when we consider the Western narrative as dominant, we must remember that the latter also keeps on changing. As mentioned by Dr. Nemat in our discussion, there was a time when no one used the term intervention for Afghanistan. And then there came the phase of calling it an invasion or an occupation. Thus people's positions change. Women have taken to streets and called out the leaders, but the focus is often on the role played by international communities and international aid. This is driven by the narrative that the Afghan women will be liberated and saved by them. Dr. Nemat provided the example of Aisha, when Times magazine reiterated that Afghan women need to be saved after her case of domestic violence where her husband had cut her nose. In her analysis, this case of domestic violence could still not be prevented in the presence of the Western forces. Bringing the attention back to the concepts we set out to unpack at the beginning of our podcast, we still wanted to go through the lens of the shelters, and in addition to what we discussed with Sonia, we asked Dr. Nemat about shelters today in Afghanistan.
If Taliban stay for a very long period of time in power, this is an F conditional because we don't know. These kind of forces come and go. Our history is a proof of that. But if they stay longer, you will see a very strong homegrown force or pressure on Taliban to come up with some changes. Slowly, the Taliban authorities are coming to realize that the shelters or safe houses are needed. I know it will be like a shocking thing for a lot of people who will listen. This, how come the Taliban are going to accept that there is a need for a shelter? As someone who founded the whole formalization of the shelters in Afghanistan, myself and another couple of my colleagues from another organization, the way we convince them is that if there is not a safe house in a specifically arranged way that protects the dignity of these women who run away from violence and from threats, these women will be either ending in prisons, like it is at the moment. Again, because there is no shelter, so there are women who are protected in prisons, or they will end up in the hand of traffickers, smugglers, bad guys. So a shelter is a dignified way of ensuring that they are living in a safe and protected place that they are not at risk of anything. So if in a proper language this is communicated with the current authorities, there is a possibility that the shelters re-emerged.
Here, Dr. Nemat is highlighting that if there are no shelters that aim at protecting the dignity of women who run away from violence or threats, they could end up in prisons or in the hands of traffickers or smugglers. Dr. Nemat described an incident that occurred in Nangarhar, a province in Afghanistan. On the 15th of August, following the Taliban takeover and the collapse of the former government, all prisons were opened and all prisoners were left free, no matter the crime committed. However, the women didn't move an inch because where would they go? They felt the best alternative, as opposed to returning to public life, was to stay in prison. In this struggle, we asked ourselves what the current situation is for Afghan women and how the current Taliban context is shaping women's lives and freedom. One of the earliest demonstrations when the Taliban first came into power in 2001 was from Herat. In the first period, the worst punishment for women in public was beating and lashing. Now, the most recent Talibans are part of the police force, military, protectors, the rulers of the city.
You see that the women's movement in Afghanistan never died. It actually took different shapes. So what we've seen practically, this is the case. I remember saying that or talking about it, that probably the scale, the scope will change. Undoubtedly, it has changed. We had a lot of projects, we had a lot of programs. When we had resources, we had money to run and operate those projects. We had human resources on the ground in the country to do that. We don't have it now, but it doesn't mean that everything stopped.
Today, in a way, this shape is represented by women who have taken their voice to the streets to claim their rights. They are well aware of the potential threats and risks entailed in the struggle against the Talibs, but despite this, they still have the courage to demonstrate. As Dr. Nemat stated, there is fear, but there is also resilience. For Afghan women today, freedom might mean the ability to be able to move around, work, and provide for their children's education. Nan Kar Azadi, bread, jobs, freedom, as they say and live by. With the change in regime, again in 2021, women are still in the stage of testing waters, and resistance has taken different forms, but it is not absent. Afghan women in business communities are part of commercial association, and these women, according to Dr. Nemat, are one of the most resilient groups. Even the women in social sectors, health, education, security, have been actively participating in claiming their agency. It seems from the interview with Dr. Nemat that while there seems to be more control and fear, there is an ongoing process that generates some form of homegrown pressure on the Taliban to make concessions in certain aspects. With this final idea, I want to wrap up our thematic analysis. We thank both of our interviewees for their inputs in helping us frame our discussion, and now I want to give the floor back to Mary.
Thank you, Pedro. Hopefully, the analysis unpacks some concepts that were somewhat unclear before today's podcast. Now, I would like to not only draw some conclusions, but also leave our listeners with some thoughts. As our title suggests, understanding women's agency through the lens and experiences of Afghan women requires a historical perspective and a narrative created by women and a story told by women themselves. Within the frame of our course, Human Rights and Humanitarianism, we simultaneously wanted to state that our approach for this podcast has been, above anything, to discuss agency away from the discourse surfacing from the white man's burden of saving brown women from brown men. With a view to do it through the lens of Afghan women, our discussions with Dr. Nemat and Dr. Esen Termizi took us through the lives of those women who have been living under oppressive circumstances and how they dealt with it. A historical perspective shows that the concept of runaways is not as new as the concept of shelters. Whether it is in prisons or through traditions, patriarchy, or modernity, it made us realize how the act of leaving becomes a moment of liberation. To break through oppression in that very moment, when one is not sure of what lies ahead, but still takes up the courage to break the rules and reclaim their space. Nevertheless, we would like to stress to the listeners that courage and bravery, or breaking the rules, should not in any way be interpreted as a glorification of the pain and suffering these women have endured. Most of the time, we think of respect and honor as living within normative rules, but these examples of Afghan women have shown us that respect can appear in the act of breaking the rules. Even so, it remains difficult to determine whether shelters are tools of emancipation or simply means of escaping. As seen through Afghan women's narratives, we saw women have been making efforts to fight for their rights and claim their agency. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights exemplifies this idea in its second article, where it states that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as sex, for instance. In addition, when it comes down to Afghan women's roles in society from an economic and social point of view, there is room for them. As pointed out by Dr. Nemat in her interview, women have continued to make strides in different realms, be it through business or demonstrations on the streets. However, the room needs strengthening, and it needs to be done in a balanced as well as structured way. We need to think about this issue in a more constructive way, since protection of Afghan women is neither a Western nor a political project, but a humanitarian duty. We'd like to thank our speakers for their valuable time and inputs, and thank you for sparing time to listen to us today.